They had been walking for hours beneath a sky that looked as if it had been scraped clean of mercy. Wind cut across the plains in thin, hard ribbons. The wheels of their broken cart lay half buried in drift. Arthur's shoulders were drawn in, not because the cold demanded it, but because his grief had taught his body how to fold itself small. He led 5 children by hand and by will. Rose, 10, with a face like a pressed flower. Daniel, 8, who still clung to his father's coat when the wind rose. Little Maggie, 6, who carried a stub of bread wrapped in oilcloth. Samuel, 4, who shuffled close to his sister. And tiny Eli, 2. A child too young to understand much, except that he was always either hungry or sleepy or both. Behind them, 2 older boys from the ranch, Thomas and Luke, followed with the heavy tread of men who had learned to hide softer things beneath stolid faces. They had been part of Arthur's household long enough to remember the old rhythms of the house. Margaret's laugh in summer, lines of drying herbs, the feel of newly shorn wool. They had also learned another rhythm. The subtle ways a man could lose himself without leaving. 3 winters ago, when Margaret died, Arthur had not only lost his wife, he had lost his center. He took to wandering the property in a daze, leaving tasks half done, letting fences fall. Eventually, the weight of the world and a debt collector's knock had driven him from the homestead he could no longer hold in his grief. That evening, the boys' contempt settled over Clara's little cabin like the first thin veil of frost. They exchanged looks, short, sharp, as the small figure at the door opened it and peered out with an expression that measured need as if it were something she had seen often enough to know its shape and its price. "Do you have coin?" Luke asked before either of them could stop him. The question came out clipped, more accusation than curiosity. It carried an old strange kind of shame. The shame of a man taught that worth was counted in ledgers and stock? Of a household that needed to be defended against what hunger might do to a man. Arthur tightened his grip on the reins, and for a moment the wind swiped his face and the past opened like a ragged book. He tasted coal and morning. He remembered Margaret's last winter, how her hands had smoothed the blanket over him while he slept in the chair and how her voice had told him to eat, to rise. He almost answered, but eyes that had learned to close against the world opened instead. The hollowness in his children's cheeks, the way Daniel's fingers went numb when he tried to wiggle them. Other men might have thrown down the range of reasons to go on. Arthur had no words to throw. He only paused, as if listening for a permission he no longer felt entitled to claim. Clara Benet stepped back and opened the door wider. Her cabin smelled faintly of boiled bone and linen starch and the stubborn perfume of mending thread. Her hands were calloused, but the marks of a seamstress, little thin scars at the fingertips, gave them another story. She did not pretend that her larder held much. There was no chest of coin by her hearth. Yet she stood as though she had been expecting anyone to come and had been waiting to decide whether to open or to turn them away. She chose to open. "You've come in a bad weather," she said simply, and her voice was like a small bell that did not ring out so much as make room. She motioned inside as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world to hold a family in the space between your table and your stove. Thomas snorted and crossed his arms. "We'll get whatever we need and leave," he muttered, an announcement of control rather than a plan. He wanted to preserve the humiliation in its right place before it could be transformed. Inside, the cabin's single window was fogged by breath and by the stove's faint breath. Mended curtains, patchwork of sturdy cottons, hung unevenly. They were evidence of long-lived resourcefulness rather than shame. A threadbare rug, a small shelf of jars, a trunk with a crooked lock. Clara's life spoke of little steady refusals to give up on the next day. She moved with purpose, placing a cushion for Eli, motioning to the children to shed their wet coats, offering boiled broth in tin cups. It was humble fare, a thin stew that smelled of onion and barley, and the tiniest hint of rosemary. Clara ladled it with care, and when Rose's eye met hers, she offered a smile that warmed like a hearth. The sons watched with the posture of men unused to being undone. Pride had taught them to measure help in coins and contracts. Help that arrived in thread and bread seemed at first a kind of fraud. "It's charity," Thomas said loud enough that Clara heard. "We won't owe or beg." Luke's jaw worked. There was a memory behind his eyes of other doors that had slammed beneath the weight of a shamed request. His instinct was to guard the household's reputation, to keep the sharp edges of humiliation at bay. Arthur's voice, when he found it, held the thinness of someone who had not spoken much lately. "If she's offering," he said, "we take. We owe her nothing." There was a softness in his words that surprised even him. The first time he had to ask for help was like tasting a foreign fruit, clumsy and strange and somehow sweet. But Clara's cabin was not a spectacle. It was a place where ordinary human needs met ordinary human kindness, and that was enough to begin to undo certain rigidities. If you watch a person long enough, you begin to see how their past is stitched into their present gestures. Arthur's hands had once roped and weighted hay. They were steady. Clara's hands had once hemmed gowns and patched soldiers' boots. They were quick and exact. Thomas and Luke had both learned early that men could be measured by what they could withhold. They had grown up in a house where a father's pride took the shape of ledger lines. They kept their posture, but their bellies betrayed them, hollow, thin. The gray day outside made everyone smaller. Inside, the stove fought for every inch of warmth. "Thank you," Arthur said to Clara, and it was the entire shape of a penitent man's gratitude. Clara shrugged off the praise. She lowered her eyes and wrapped a blanket tighter around Eli. "Sit," she said to Rose, and the child obeyed as if sitting were now a prayer answered. The little voices filled the cabin with the easy noises of being alive. The clink of tin, a breath caught then released, the faint rhythmic sound of Clara's needle working at a sleeve. If this story is reaching you, if a small act of courage feels like a light in a dark place, stay with us a while and press like, Arthur might have thought to say if he were telling the tale. Instead, outside the window, the wind made the branches scrape like fingers. Inside, people leaned toward each other without knowing they did. Across the next hours, there was a slow, steady unwrapping of dignity. Clara boiled more water and soaked the children's aching feet. She set a clean linen over the toddler's head to stifle the hot breath of fever. Her seamstress's eye took in the coats, the torn hems, the missing buttons. She busied herself with the work she knew best. For payment she offered something more than broth. She offered sure, deliberate presence. Thomas shrugged as if to say that if staying was all they were getting, it was still too much. Luke made his displeasure into a half-joke. "We might freeze a little less if people like her kept the world warm," he said. The words were mean, but they had the sound of trying to anchor himself in old habits, to make contempt into a shield. Night came on like a lid. The stove's glow thinned to embers, and the children's heat rose with unintended force. Around midnight, not Elizabeth. Arthur's mind misfired from long sleep. Around midnight, Rose's forehead burned with fever. Her breaths came quick and shallow. Clara propped her up, pressed a cloth to the child's brow, and sang in a thread of a voice. An old lullaby she had heard as a girl, words that held no doctrine but a human promise. The rhythm of the song made the cabin breathe differently. It gave room for hope to sit down beside despair. Thomas, who had claimed before that he would rather not owe anyone a thing, moved without thinking. He fetched more firewood. He carried bowls of cooling broth. Each motion he made was clumsy, as if the language of care were one he had forgotten, and each act taught his hands a better way to be steady. Luke, on the other hand, fought a different battle. He kept his face blunt and his voice short, but every small act of help was a confession on his lips. He sat up most of the night, fingers clenched, listening to Rose's breaths while the child's small chest rose and fell like a badly tuned bell. When the fever climbed higher and Daniel's skin flushed, the cabin filled with a different sort of fear, one that did not humiliate, but asked for the nakedest form of truth, that life was fragile and hands mattered. Clara never flinched. She took off her own shawl and wrapped it around Eli. She brewed herbs she had tucked in a jar for such nights, ground and bitter, and held together with the knowledge of which roots eased a fever and which soothed a cough. She had been poor a long time and learned that poverty did not make a person invincible. It taught her to respond with what she had. She paced and mended. She laughed softly to Anne, no, to Maggie, so she would not hear the low panic in her own chest. Arthur found himself sitting on a low stool and watching. He had been a man of decisions and deeds, but grief had so hollowed out his center that action felt like an estranged friend. Watching Clara's hands, he felt an old familiarity return. The calluses on his palms, the knot of a nail that needed to be driven home, how a man could make things hold together again. He rose and offered his help. Clara handed him a splintered board for the window, one she had been meaning to fix for weeks but had not afforded the time, and he worked with a hammer as if the rhythm of the strike might beat out what had been beaten into him. There were small moments that looked like nothing and ended up like everything. One of the boys, Samuel, stirred in sleep and cried out. Clara smoothed his hair and told him, without naming prayer, that the night would end. Thomas heard that and felt something hot and new inside him. It was shame not as a punishment, but as a mirror. He thought of the way his father used to clap him on the shoulder and say, "You are men of the ranch," as if being a man meant being untouched by pity. He had kept that law like armor. Seeing Clara's hands that had never been rich, made him feel foolish for having believed that to be worth, you must be untouching. As dawn came, thin and pale, the children's fever broke enough for sleep to come in ragged waves. Rose's face lost its sheen of heat. Daniel's breath steadied, the slump in Arthur's shoulders eased by a fraction. He understood, with a sudden clarity that cut through years of fog, that the world had not been trying to punish him for his sorrow. It had been waiting to be rearranged into something alive again. There was, however, the practical world to face. No sooner had the sun shown itself as a wan, watchful eye than the landlord arrived. He came in a carriage that had its own quiet smell of authority, linseed oil, and a certain kind of disregard. He demanded rent in a voice that did not bother to be polite. He scowled at the patched curtains like they were evidence of idiocy rather than resilience. Clara's face hardened for a moment. The landlord had a ledger. He had been precise about dates and interest, and about the law's merciless way of weighing a human being. Arthur felt the old reflex to stand down. He had learned, in the 3 years since Margaret's last breath, that to fight sometimes meant to drag up a fight you were too emptied to win. He had done that before, and had found himself at the edge of the land he once owned, watching dust take the place of laughter. He had escaped the ledger only to collide with a new poverty that was physical and not entirely financial. But as the landlord spoke, Clara's voice came out sharp, clear as a bell on a cold morning. "You have my debt," she said, and it was an attempt to be pragmatic. "I'll have it by next harvest." The landlord's face twisted. He had heard that promise many times from poor mouths. It sounded to him like a trick. "You know the terms," he sneered. "You are behind by 3 months. If you cannot pay, the law requires—" His words were practiced cruelty. Thomas and Luke shifted. Pride proved again to be poor armor. Watching his children had taught Arthur how desperate the world could be, and he would not let Clara's roof be taken the way his had been. The claim of ownership on the land had been a whisper in the back of his head all through the night. He had left the homestead, yes. He had walked away from the ledger and the gossip. But the land was part of his bones. He knew its lines and its soil, the place where Margaret had once planted her roses. The idea rose in him like a small stubborn flame, the truth that he could still answer a ledger, that wealth could be used not for boast, but for healing. He strode forward, the way a man does when he knows he must offer what relief he can, and the landlord's lips curled in the expected way. Arthur did not parade who he had been or what he had owned. He only spoke with a steadiness that had been stripped raw and rebuilt. "Pay what she owes," he said to the landlord, and when the man gaped, Arthur set a coin down on the table between them to promise his words. He had the money, savings he had hidden in a barn wall, small perhaps, but enough to make a start. The landlord looked at Clara and at the coin, and then at Arthur, as if some small rule of the world had been overturned. "You were—" the landlord began, but Arthur cut him off. "I'll buy her time," he said, "and if it is possible, I will secure what is hers." The exchange that followed was more than money changing hands. It was the slow unpick of shame. Arthur insisted that the deed be placed in Clara's name, not in his. It was a clumsy, humble sort of reparation. He had, in fleeing, left another person to bear the cost of his private extinguishing. He would not allow that now. The landlord, clearly puzzled by the turn of events, set the papers before them, and watched as Clara, with trembling fingers, accepted something she had never expected, security that read like a promise. For Thomas and Luke, the moment was a rupture. The world they had trusted to define them, ledgers, titles, a father who had once been expansive then withdrawn, reshaped itself. They had seen their father, listless and distant for 3 winters, offer his last common courtesy of coin to a woman he had hardly known. He had bought her time and offered her a steak. The gesture cracked something open in both of them. Pride is a funny wound. Sometimes it heals only when you see it scatter in the light of another's kindness. Arthur did not curtain his motives with a speech. He had no eloquence left for such things. At night, long years had pared him down. When he knelt, because that is what he did, before Clara, the gesture had nothing showy in it. He took her hand in both of his and let the wind carry away the pretense of what a man ought to be. "I have been walking around with half a life for 3 winters," he said. "If you would let me, I would make the rest of it whole." Clara's face taut the hush in the room. She had been used to being offered pity wrapped in a ribbon of pretense. What Arthur offered was clumsy, honest, and terrifying because it asked for trust where she had grown to expect caution. She thought of the children's small faces softened by sleep, of the patches on her curtains slowly gathering the dust of the years, of the ledger that had trailed her like a shadow. She also thought of the seamstress work she had enjoyed, how a well-placed stitch could change the curve of a hem, how a mended handkerchief could hold someone's pocket of hope. "Yes," she said then, and it sounded like the unhooking of both their shackles. "Yes, if you still have a place for a woman who sews." The sun's change was not instantaneous. Repentance in them came not as a lightning strike, but as little thaws in a long winter. They watched Clara teach Rose how to sew a patch. They saw her show patience where they had known only brusqueness. They felt their own hands learn from her hands, and in every small lesson their rigidity loosened. Thomas began to fetch water not as a penance, but because the action itself felt cleaner than the brittle forms of pride. Luke smiled, sometimes, when Maggie held out a mended doll and called him friend. There was a scene that everyone who lived there would remember. If any of them were asked to recall the exact detail, it would always be the same. One afternoon, just as the first green threaded the ground like something tentative and miraculous, Rose and Daniel chased a hen that had escaped into the yard. It was a foolish, bright thing, children laughing as if laughter were a currency they were allowed to spend. The boys, Thomas and Luke, fell into the chants of joy like fish into still water. Luke, chasing after a hen, slipped on a bank, and would certainly have gone down had Clara not reached for him, steadying him with a single hand. He felt the touch and knew there was no deliberate cure in that hand, only an offer. He looked up and met her eyes with a new understanding. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was older but lighter. People who have been poor and people who have been proud share a surprising language. They can both recognize when an offering is made without strings. Clara's offerings were simple and without calculation. She did not insist on their gratitude. She did not tally the hours she stayed up with fevers. She simply stayed. In time, that staying rewired the household's sense of worth. Into that slow mending came other small repairs. Arthur fixed the cabin's window frames. Thomas and Luke learned the discipline of a bread oven. Clara, in turn, taught them the peculiar economy of needles and thread, how a single stitch, taken well, could outlive 100 careless ones. On the shelf near the stove sat Margaret's old cup. Arthur had told the story one evening, voice low, of how Margaret had loved chamomile and saved her coins to buy a new ribbon. The cup became a talisman neither sacred nor magical, only a little piece of the life that had once been and might be again. There were conversations in the long evenings, the kind that do not convince at first, but which seed change. Arthur spoke of the days when he had been both bold and foolish, days when he had tried to hold tightly onto everything and had lost the most precious by trying to grip too hard. He told the boys of a woman who had taught him what gentleness looked like. Thomas confessed the brittle education of men who had been taught to keep feelings private. Luke told of a night when he had once been the one who needed help and had been turned away. These were small confessions, a string of little acts of unburdening, and each confession demanded a response that was more than a perfunctory nod. Love in that cabin did not arrive as a banner. It arrived as the addition of small things that made living possible. A new patch on a child's sleeve, a garden dug by 3 pairs of hands, the planting of Margaret's roses in a corner of the yard. Arthur and Clara found in each other not a rescue but a partnership, a person to share bread with and to hold in the night. He did not save her. She did not martyr herself. They became, in the most human sense, a repairment. The house that had been Clara's now held more laughter and fewer sharp silences. The boys, once people of restraint and reservation, learned to be clumsy with kindness. Not all transformations were smooth. There were nights when old instincts rose up and tried to stake their claims. Thomas would sometimes snap at a child for a small wrong and then stand horrified at his own harshness. Luke would retreat for a day or two, as if testing whether his new tenderness was merely borrowed and could be lost. Arthur had his own relapse into old silences, but the pattern had been changed. The presence of steady, unassuming care made it increasingly difficult to be cruel for long. Spring came early that year, and it left a trail of green along the fence line. The children's cheeks filled out. Eli learned to stand without clutching. Samuel learned a word he had not known: home. The landlord's carriage passed the lane one morning and did not stop. The ledger was paid, and the small indignities that had once haunted Clara's porch were smoothed away by legal papers with proper seals. Arthur and Clara married not to erase separate histories, but to enter into common ones. The ceremony was a modest thing: a small circle of neighbors, a bench pulled from the shed for Margaret's old cup, and a few words that felt old as well as new. Promises to care, to work, to keep the hearth warm. Thomas and Luke stood as witnesses not out of duty, but because they wanted their names to be in the small book of a family's new configuration. In time, the rancher's sons were as likely to be found tending the garden as they were to be mending fences. The public reversal that the title of their story might have suggested, a fall from grace of one kind and a rising of another, was not a sudden theatrical conversion for any of them. It was ordinary redemption, a slow recognition that pride could be traded for service, and that a man who helped a child through a fever had more currency than a man who counted deeds from a ledger. People who had once looked down on the poor woman now watched as she altered the very texture of their days. She taught patience in a world that had been taught to do without it. She taught the boys how to measure a life by the number of beds warmed and hands mended rather than by acres on a map. Arthur found in marriage not an answer but a companion. He found his way back into the world in quiet steps, tending the fence, fixing the roof, teaching Daniel to read by the light of the stove when winter wind rattled at the shutters. Their story traveled through the nearby villages not as a sensational piece, no harps were played, but as people told it over fences and in markets, a tale of a seamstress who took in a broken family, and a rancher who, in repaying her, found himself repaid in a different currency. People who heard it would sometimes ask whether the children had been healed by a miracle. The truth was simpler. A fever broke with a woman's attention, a stove, warm broth, and the slow easing of panic. No divine promise was preached from a pulpit. What was offered was a human answer to human need. That was enough. On a late afternoon, with the sun rubbing its last heat across the yard, Arthur sat on the stoop and watched the children at play. Rose had braided Maggie's hair with a stray ribbon. Daniel chased a dog he had taught to heel. Thomas, with his hands in the dirt, laughed easily at a joke Luke told. A laugh that belonged to a man who had learned to be in the world again without using pride as a scaffold. Clara joined Arthur on the step and leaned her head against his shoulder. Their hands met and fit. He thought of Margaret with no acidity and no rose-colored fog. He thought of the years of silence and the way a woman with a spool of thread had taught him how to stitch a life back together. "People asked me once," Arthur said softly, speaking more to himself than to her, "what is the use of wealth if it cannot be used to keep people safe?" Clara's smile was quiet. "Wealth used only to hold tight," she replied, "becomes a weight that breaks the holder. True wealth is shared. It is the warmth of a hearth when the world is cold." It was not a sermon. It was a truth they had learned in the doing. The rancher's sons, who had once despised the poor woman because they thought their world needed fortification against dependence, had been transformed by the witness of her ordinary love. They had learned to measure worth in hands that could steady a fevered brow rather than in the heaviness of a deed box. Their former scorn had not been a moral absolute. It was an armor from a household culture that valued stoicism over kindness. That armor had been melted down by steady, patient mercy. The final image that held and would come to mean the story was not a public spectacle, but a private table. 5 children laughing over stale bread warmed up and made new by Peggy's, no, by Clara's care. Two men setting out tools for a morning's work with no need to be more than they were. A woman whose life had been small because the world demanded it now allowed smallness to be generous. Outside, the first true green of spring unfurled in careless defiance of winter. If the story teaches anything beyond itself, it is that the things that change a life are often the least showy. A blanket offered without a ledger, a hand that steadies another without expecting to be paid in grand returns. Hospitality is not a performance, it is a habit, an act repeated until people who would not have stayed are no longer strangers. Dignity is not a thing to be given like a coin, it is a thing to be recognized, to be returned. Sometimes people will ask whether Clara's care was heroic. She would have shrugged at the title and returned to her needle. Heroism, in her view, lived in the steady rhythm of ordinary things. Boiling broth, sewing a hem, sitting up with a fevered child. Arthur, who had once been rich and then had refused to be rich by choosing exile, came to prefer these small, honest acts to the displays of wealth he had known before. He had been humbled by loss and then rebuilt in the place where he had been most human. They did not end their days with some grand declaration. They lived long enough to watch Margaret's roses bloom, and a season after that. The boys married and tended the fields. Rose took to sewing like her life depended on it, and made garments that people in the village came to ask after. People would come by years later and pretend to be surprised that a seamstress had altered the course of a ranching family. The surprise was only for those who believed power belonged only to ledgers and names written big. The real surprise was that a poor woman's steady hands could contain enough grace to change what human beings have been taught to fear. At the close of the day, Arthur and Clara walked the fence line, a slow, companionable circuit. She held his arm in a way neither of them felt the need to speak about. The boys waved from the field, and the children ran to them with their small brown faces shining. When Arthur looked at Clara, he saw not a savior, nor a wrecked relic of poverty, but a person who had the particular courage to do what needed to be done, again and again, without boasting. "And if anyone asks what changed us," Clara said, looking up at the sky that had long ago stopped being merely white and cold, and had begun to hold the faintest promise of evening stars, "tell them it was no miracle. Tell them it was a woman who did what she could do, and men who stopped pretending they had to do everything alone." They let the sentence settle. Around them the farm breathed. Animals settled in their pens. A rooster complained at the wrong moment, and somewhere a door banged shut. The world kept its small habitual noises going, and their lives fit into that continued hum without ostentation. Share this story if it reminded you that hospitality changes lives, and if it moved you, consider coming back for more tales of ordinary grace.